Director at the University of Minnesota, present on the growth of women's sports, Title IX, Creating Future Leaders, and in addition, she will give some general updates about Gopher Athletics. But for tonight, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Leo Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the current athletic director at Minneapolis North Community High School. He spent 24 years with the Minnesota Vikings as a player, pro scout, and director of player development. Lewis received his Bachelor of Science degree in the University of Missouri, his Master of Science degree from the University of Tennessee-Knoxville, and earned his Ph.D. in Kinesiology. Yes. Okay, from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Lewis also completed a Master of Arts degree in Marriage and Family Therapy at Argosy University. Lastly, Leo's primary research and applied interest focus on the social and psychological dimensions of sports and performance. So please welcome Dr. Lewis.
Well, thank you. I hope this continues. Can you hear me? Oh, great. This is new technology for me. I'm used to just yelling all the time. But, hey, it's so good to be here in Rochester. I do come here every now and then. Not necessarily has it been recently, but I do know where Rochester is. At the same time, I remember the first time that I came through Rochester, I was going to Rushford Peterson to one of our basketball teams played down there, and it was so good to be able to scan parts of the state to play around a game of basketball and understand and meet new people and to be in other communities that appreciate us. So it's been good to come down to southern Minnesota, no doubt. It certainly is a pleasure. I think the whole notion of sport this month with the lecture series is really good for me because I live it, I breathe it, and oftentimes I reflect back on the times when I played it. But I still am involved in sports to a great capacity and love to, in some respect, talk about my experiences through, and what we talk now about how through the ages people, although they're identified with sport in certain ways, are not able to enjoy it as much as they go through their careers. So one of the things that I know Ann Cole asked me about was to focus on the whole transitional aspect of sport. And I lived it. I certainly researched it as a student, a Ph.D. student, and certainly lived it as a professional football player. So what I will do is give you some of my background regarding sport involvement, talk a little bit academic to you in regards to looking at the social, cultural aspects of sport, and not necessarily the theoretical aspects, but try to give you some sense of why it is what it is, how we look at sport as part of the grand social practice in this culture of ours, and why it's so important. I was looking at the Star Tribune on Sunday, and the Star Tribune devoted 18 pages to sport news. Of that newspaper, 18 pages of it was devoted to sport. It gives you a notion of how our culture embraces sport and why we feel those who are involved in sport are so important, so much so that one of the major newspapers in this state is going to devote most of its, a lot of its sections to sport and physical activity. So I think one of the things that started me on this career path certainly was because I grew up in a sporting family. Incidentally, my father, Leo Jr., grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, was an all-star athlete at Old Marshall High School in St. Paul, was a three-sport athlete, was good enough to be able to then matriculate to college to play football at a historically black college called Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri, and became an three-time All-American. At that time, they called them Little All-Americans because they went to a small school. Nonetheless, he was able to be drafted in the National Football League. And one thing happened at this time in our culture and in sport around the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, something happened in how we looked at professional sport. Number one, the advent of TV and the media began to wrap up a little bit. So you began to see a lot of sporting events on TV, even in color, as you well know. And what came with that was the economic popularism of funding sports, which by and large, every sport entity in the college and professional level, as you may know, is really supported by corporations. It couldn't survive without corporate support. So one thing happened, though. Before this occurred in our nation's history, there were players like my dad. You recall Bud Grant, who also went to the University of Minnesota and played for the Philadelphia Eagles at the time, but then also decided to go to Canada to play football because he made more money. Okay? He made $1,000 more. That was enough at that time in the 1950s to go to a different league to play. And so did my dad. So I have the honor of really talking about how this all got started with me, because the fact that my dad played with Bud Grant for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and then also was coached by Bud Grant at Winnipeg started this whole connection and relationship with the Grant family. As you well know, Bud ended up coming down here and became the head coach for the Minnesota Vikings and certainly became a Hall of Fame coach in the National Football League. My dad, nonetheless, became a Canadian Football League Hall of Famer, and because of his exploits in college, became a College Football Hall of Famer in the United States. So I'm really proud of his exploits. Actually, he was a bigger and better player than me. But at the same time, it got this relationship started with the Minnesota Vikings. So in summary, my dad lived in Minnesota most of his youth. He teams up with Bud Grant. They became teammates, and also he was coached by Bud. And consequently, Bud asked me to try out for the Vikings. He cut me, though, first year. But he asked me to try out for the Vikings because he gave my dad a favor that he certainly owed. Consequently, I would then, be able to hang on the next year and play for the Vikings for 11 years. So part of this whole lecture here is to really give you a sense of what it's like for an individual who has played at a high level. And it's not just about football. It can be about any sport. Actually, it can be about any profession. Because when we talk about transition, and some of you have gone through that in your profession that you have pursued throughout your years, about some of the emotional aspects of that transition, about some of the economic aspects of that, and some of the social aspects of how you transition from working 40 to 50 hours a week to retiring. Okay, it happens in sports also, but there's a lot more involved in how a student athlete or a professional athlete deals with the whole emotional and cultural as well as practical element of transitioning from being a highly regarded athlete to not being a highly regarded athlete. So we'll talk a little bit about the social aspect of that, the emotional aspect of that, but then also some of the practical aspects of how athletes become athletes and what happens to them after they retire or after they leave the game as a avocation or a profession. Okay, so I want to kind of go a little bit with my sport history. This is my dad and I when I was a little toddler, obviously, and I started out with football. It wasn't necessarily because of my dad being a football player, but it was because my friends played. Oftentimes when you get at an age where you're preteen and, you have a community that supports sports, back in the 60s, one of the sports that they supported was football. And my friends played football, so I did too. Played baseball in the summer. Okay, my dad was one of my coaches. But I had these opportunities available to me when I was a youth. Played high school football. Actually, I was a quarterback. I know you're looking at me and you're saying, he was a Viking? This guy? Okay, back then in high school, I was 5'8", 165 pounds. Okay, that's unheard of nowadays. But again, we can't change that. We can't change that. But lo and behold, I played with a lot of good athletes. We won the state championship in Missouri. I lived in Columbia, Missouri most of my life. My mother met my father at Lincoln University, and she was a resident of Columbia, Missouri. So we ended up staying down there and living down there. But I played with a lot of good athletes. And I tell kids today, if it wasn't for my teammates, I wouldn't be the person that I am today. But it just so happens I was very fortunate. I was very fortunate to be able to play with some athletes who were very successful also. On my high school team, 22 of my teammates went to college to play football. 4 of our teammates played professionally. So we had a pretty good team back then. Even nowadays, that's uncommon. Played a little basketball also. I show this because I want to always tell people I had a little, spring in my step. I was able to get up there even though I was 5'8". And again, one of my favorite pictures where my father, who was certainly came up to visit one of our practices when we were at Winter Park in Eden Prairie, and took a picture with myself and Bud at the time. This was early on in my career. By the way, I was successful enough. I've got a slide that should have preceded this one, but I went to the University of Missouri after I left high school, and played football there for 4 years. I was a high school quarterback also, and was very successful. But again, I wanted to get on the field, and my coaches changed me to a wide receiver, and I became a wide receiver throughout my professional career. These are some images of all those days of hurt and sweat. It just so happens, this is one of my favorite too. I'm always smiling because this is the last training camp of my career. And I was smiling because I was so happy I didn't have to go through this again. And consequently, it was a good day. So I want to go back to the whole notion. I think I mentioned to you about the social and cultural aspects of being involved in sport, and some of the detrimental aspects of transitioning. And if we can keep our mind on how a person identifies with being an athlete, okay? Certainly there's some self-esteem involved. You're supported in some of your endeavors. But let's go even further than that. What is sport anyway? I have a lot of times, I teach a class at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and oftentimes I try to get my class to let's go back to just the simple aspects of what is sport. And sometimes they can't really define what sport is. Okay? And how is that different from the term physical activity? Okay? So when we talk about sport, it's physical, okay? It doesn't mean you have to butt heads or hit someone, but it's physical, meaning you can literally just walk or roller skate or skip, It's competitive, okay? Just understand how when you watch sports, all these elements come into play. It's institutionalized, so that means someone's governing it, someone's managing it. There's that pie in the sky, that house in the sky that oversees the element of sport and helps make decisions on how it's delivered to the public. It's guided by established rules, okay? Motivated by internal and external rewards, whether that's money, whether that's self-esteem, motivation, internal motivation or external motivation. But all these are elements of sport that we know today. Okay. Now, I'm young enough, old enough to understand when I was a kid that most of these elements weren't available to me and my friends. We oftentimes just needed to go outside. Sometimes we were kicked out by my mother so that we wouldn't tear up all of her furniture. Okay, we were kicked out of the house. We just invented games. We started playing for the fun of it. Okay, because there was not necessarily needing to be a purpose for engaging in sport. We just did it for the fun of it. Some of that I feel is lost. It certainly was lost with my children when they were growing up. They participated because their friends did. Okay, plain and simple. I didn't push them at all, but I encouraged them. Let's say that. But again, is there an alternative definition? And most times when I talk to my students, I ask them, why do some sports count and others don't? Why are some sports more important than others? Okay, and it's a broad micro perspective because it really has a lot to do with power, privilege, and influence. We won't get into that, but it really has a lot to do with power, privilege, and influence. So I have a picture that depicts the game of squash. And anyone know what the game of squash is? Okay, some of you do. It is played in the United States. Okay, it's similar to racquetball. Did you know racquetball was only played in the United States? Squash is played all over the world. But why doesn't that count more than American football, for example, or American basketball? Okay, we go back to those three statements: power, privilege, and influence. They have a lot to do with that. We have to also remember that sport is always contested. There's always some struggle with the meaning of why we participate in sport, the purpose of it. Okay, and it's always considered, the answer is really always considered by those who have power, privilege, and influence. Okay? All right. Sports today, what makes them historically unique? It's secular. It's built on equality. Sometimes that's a facade, but we want to think that. There's specialization involved. You know, youth today, it's hard for them to go out for three sports like some of us did in the good old days because they specialize so much in some of these sports. There's some rationalization. There's governance, like I mentioned to you. It's institutionalized. There's quantification. What about numbers? Everyone looks at the numbers all the time. Sometimes it's a way to value a person or a sport. And then we keep records. Now, I talk about this postmodern sport element, which we are in today, and how that differs from sport in the turn of the 20th century or sport in 1950 to 1960 when after World War II, it was mainly used to help socialize our youth. Okay, it's still a great element. It does socialize our youth. Sport does. But this whole postmodern part of sport, where people are highly critical of it, is part of the new age of social media, you know, and the fact that everyone does have an opinion. You know, this whole postmodern approach where there's more than one truth is part of our culture as well as sport. Now recall, sport is just a manifestation of our culture and what we value. Okay? So understanding that, there's a growing affluent class in sport, just like it is in our culture. The rise of participation in spectator sports. And is it amazing that the University of Michigan, Ohio State University, have at their football game over 100,000 people at each football game? And many of them don't participate in sport or are physically active. It's amazing how a sport like that can conjure up an economy of people who don't even exercise. Okay? So it's pervasive in sport business and labor, obviously. Does sport really hire a lot of people? Yeah, I would say that it does. Can those people find jobs elsewhere? Yes, they probably could if there wasn't a sporting event there. Expansion of amateur and professional sports. Okay, you can be a professional in just about any physical activity nowadays. How many of you know of the sport pickleball? Oh, yes, a growing sport. I'll even admit, a growing sport among citizens who are 50 and above. The city of Edina just okayed $150,000 to build pickleball courts in one of their parks. Transportation is a big issue. The revolution of mass communication. Obviously, we talked about social media and what it does to give us more information, and as well, the 200 to 400 TV channels, which we will never see in a mass of those in our lifetime, is a product of this mass communication fix that we have with sport also. One of the tasks that I ask my students is to look at a point in time, 30 minutes of your day, and find as many sporting events on TV as you can. Okay? And determine why those sports are on at that particular time. Oftentimes, you'll find that the major sports are on what we call the most advantaged time period to watch TV, which is after work and before you go to bed. Okay? Those sports that are not given as much notice are on from midnight until 8 a.m. possibly, or on days where no one wants to watch TV. Okay? The economists are smart because they even put those sports that don't get a lot of notice on prime time during certain parts of the year. Let's just say a Saturday around noon, when you know in the summer no one's going to be watching TV, or quite few of us are not going to be watching TV at that particular time. So sport kind of mirrors the values of North America: competition and success. The value means to achieve. I mean, there's some value in us striving to achieve. Okay, so sport reflects, our culture in that respect. Progress, external conformity, conforming to cultural values, for example. It's also in sport. So what happens in sports? It constructs and enables opportunities. I mean, kids nowadays have so many opportunities to be physically active. It doesn't necessarily have to be in sport. Okay, it doesn't have to necessarily be in an organized fashion or institutionalized fashion like sport. It's a platform for moral development, like I mentioned to you before. After World War II, okay, the valued component of socializing our youth was through sport also, as well as through other social institutions. The relationships are given meaning through interaction. So some of our best friends were connected with us through sporting involvement, or they can be. Sport offers diverse experiences, develops new relationships, opportunities to explore and develop identities, and I found that true when you're transitioning from anything to another set of valued components or social practices. Okay, you find that you have been identified as a professional football player. I'm still identified as a professional football player. I haven't played in 24 years, for example. That's an example of how that some people see my identity as still as a professional football player. Transferable skills and lessons, which is a good topic to talk to. When people are transitioning, as well as when athletes are transitioning from being an athlete to being a non-athlete, then the opportunity to develop and display competence. Some people really get a lot of self-esteem by knowing that they've accomplished something. So why participate in sports? It connects with other interests and goals. People feel that if you're competent in something, you gain respect. I think that's kind of why we put athletes on a pedestal sometimes, because we know they do something spectacular or exceptional. Social support and other resources are there. Memorable activities. And helps us control our lives. So we have something to do. So if you can remember when you started to be physical active when you were a young person, you had one of these social agents be pretty responsible for it. I told you about my kids. They had friends that told them what to do. They had friends that determined what sports they played in. It wasn't me. I just followed behind them. Family, siblings, peers, coaches, schools, mass media. What was it for you? If you are physically active or was physically active when you were a young person, who was it that helped you maintain that interest and motivation? So let's go back to youth sport, major trends in youth sport that really kind of still are a mainstay in the lives of our citizens when they get older too. Privatization, okay, emphasis on the performance ethic, meaning there's a value in being athletic or to perform. The rise of private and elite sports training facilities, they are bound. Minnesota's been noted for having sports training facilities much far in advance than other states. Parents are increasingly involved. I mean, I don't know how many times I had to drive that car to take my daughters to soccer and lacrosse and basketball, and how I had to wait for that half-hour practice to pick them up and take them home so that we can eat. And more importantly, I think what has really been good for our culture is that there's an increase in alternative sports. Okay, not just the main sports. I mean, who would think that you can make money skiing down on one board on a ski slope, turning flips, and not always landing on your feet, and be seen on primetime TV? Who would ever think that? Or water skiing on your feet. Or playing pickleball. You never know. There may be a pickleball national championship here pretty soon. But again, I'm leading you into this whole transition issue. I've talked a lot about the development of our youth, of our citizenry, and how we identify with sport and physical activity, and how it's so valued in our culture. Okay? But there's some issues with that too. Too much adult intrusion, pressures from parents and coaches. Okay, we've heard and read about those issues. Sports specialization, specializing in one sport, for example, and disregarding other sports that you might be as good in or better in. Okay, emphasis on the ability to play. Okay, meaning there's a number of kids who can't play because they can't afford it. Oftentimes I ask my students to go over their own sport history and tell me a little bit about that story, that narrative about why you participated in certain sports and why you didn't. And a lot of these things come about where they didn't have the money to participate in certain sports that they really liked and had to end it because they didn't have the money, or they didn't like the coach, or they were tired of their parents pressuring them to be a good athlete. Violence and abuse. We see all these issues. We see all these issues in our culture also. Disruption in education, which there's a huge argument about how sport and physical activity is so important that it is a disruption in the educational pursuits of a lot of our youth. Or could be. Let's put it that way. On the other hand, there's an argument to say that it enhances their ability to graduate because that's something that they're motivated to do. The risk of injury, which is certainly pertinent, and the whole concept of winning. Now, do we not see this in our culture? In our corporate businesses as well? Of course. So some of the student challenges that we can recognize, particularly at the college level, I mean, all students go through this, is, establishing an identity, developing new relationships, separating from families of origin, which every one of us have had in our children's wake, to make sure that they got out of the house and didn't come back. That was a goal of ours, I'm sure. For you too, balancing academic and social priorities. Okay? Now, student athletes have those issues, but they also have additional concerns. Physical concerns, certainly injuries. Oftentimes, I broke my leg in college. I caught the ball, though, but I broke my leg catching the ball. And I couldn't go to class. I mean, I was hurting. I mean, I broke my leg. You expect me to go to class the next day? I mean, I was hurting. And that was when the doctor waited until it was healed to say, man, maybe we should have put a pin in there. But he healed it through a cast that was put on an hour after I broke it. Okay? So that's when you think, physicians they know what they're doing. So physical aspects of being a student athlete kind of get in the way of their progress. Social aspects. There's a notion that student athletes are so involved in their sport that they get isolated too much on campuses. They spend 20 hours a week practicing. Okay? So what else do they have to do? They have to study, obviously, eat and breathe, get some sleep. By that time, it's no social life. The psychological, okay? Being able to manage that aspect and identity of being an athlete, and at the same time, try to get the best grades you can. And certainly time management, which is probably the most important thing to be successful. So what is the transitions? I think Schlossberg, and the reason why I take it from this theoretical approach is because this is kind of how I continue to be interested in my scholarly pursuits. I was living my transition. I started my Ph.D. in, when did I start my Ph.D.? 1986. And I didn't finish until 1997. Well, it was because I was working full-time the whole time. But one of the things that I was really interested in was living my life and seeing how every year I was on the bubble. Every year there was a chance that I wouldn't be able to play for the Vikings. Every year I could have got cut and not be able to play anymore. Every year I got hurt and always wondered, was it worth it? Because I wasn't in control. The coaches were in control. All I can control was studying my plays, being healthy enough, eating the right foods, getting enough sleep. It had anything to do with whether I was going to be on the team or not. So I was curious about that and found out that there was really no information about being able to assist student athletes and professional athletes on this emotional track that they were on. It's even as important at the college level. I don't care what level it is, D3, NAIA, D2, Division I, it doesn't matter. Athletes undergo a significant number of hours perfecting their sport, but also go under a significant number of hours maintaining their mental state and emotional makeup. So transitions occurs when an event or non-event results in a change in assumptions about oneself and the world, and this requires a corresponding change in one's behavior and relationship. So, when you react to a transition, okay, we've all had it. We've all had to react to something that occurred in our lives that we didn't expect, or that we expected that did indeed happen. And when we talk about a non-event, we talk about an event that we expected to happen that didn't even happen. Something that we expected to happen that didn't happen at all. It happens a lot in sport. Okay? You're expecting to win, but what happens when you don't win? You're expecting to score 50 points, but what happens if you don't? You're expecting to play. What happens if you don't play? Okay, all those reactions then are a way we appraise our situation. And it's a way someone interprets a transition affects the emotional and other responses to the situation. So there's an emotional makeup that occurs in these events. Okay, just think about yourself. Was there an event that you expected to happen that ended up not happening, that you really were expecting? Athletes go through this a lot. I mean, they train all hard during the week, and then when the game comes, they're expecting certain things to happen, but they've got to remember that that opponent is expecting certain things to happen too. So not everyone's going to win, for example. How do you react to that? Even an event that we interpret to be successful, when it does happen, we have an emotional connection to it. Sometimes we can't even handle winning. So in this whole transition and livelihood of being an athlete, there are circumstances that occur that we expect and circumstances that occur that we don't expect, but then there are circumstances that we expect that do not occur. Okay? All right, so some of the transitions that we really are talking about is when a young person transitions from being a high school student athlete to a college athlete, which is probably the greatest jump an individual would ever take, whether you're going to play sports or not. Going from high school to college is a tremendous jump, emotionally, socially, certainly academically. Another transition is when injuries are all too common in some sports, but when they are so detrimental that you cannot pursue your sport, it becomes an emotional trek for you also. And then to a certain extent, what I found is that academic ineligibility really is detrimental to the wherewithal of athletes, particularly at the college level. This could also be a workforce issue, where if a student athlete did not graduate, he or she would find that they have a little bit more trouble finding jobs, being able to get in the workforce, or even find the money to finish their degree. Okay? So what makes it difficult for someone to transition? Now, you can think about your own transition too, as well as what athletes go through. For example, their identity is based exclusively on their sport performance. Okay? If a person's self-worth is just based solely on how they perform, it tends to be very difficult for them to move away from that. Okay? Their aspiration and ability is not close. So maybe they want to be the best athlete on the team, but just don't have the ability. If that gap is too far separated, they're going to have problems. That often happens. I often tell a lot of my student athletes at my high school, and I'm brutal. I say, you're not that good. Okay? You may be the high school star at your high school, but there's thousands of high schools who have stars just like you. You may be the all-state player in Minnesota, but there's 50 states that have all-state players. Okay? So if one's aspiration to be great doesn't match with their ability, and they're not understanding that realism, sometimes they have problems transitioning. It helps, or if you have not, I said have, but if you haven't had experience with these transitions, you often have difficulty. So if you've always won and then all of a sudden you don't win, you may have trouble. We had an incident last year with our football team. Our football team did very well the last 2 years. They made it to the semifinals of the state championship 2 years ago and made it to the state championship, Class A, this year. And they lost both games, but they were undefeated up until then. So they were undefeated this year until the state championship game. And kids who you would think had so much confidence in their abilities, when they lost, they were treacherous. They were cussing, they were crying, they didn't believe they had anything to do with them losing. They would blame their teammates. It's amazing what happens to a person when they don't get what they want, in this case. But if you had prior experience to losing, sometimes it can help. It can help you have a little bit more realism in what it takes. Some have emotional or behavioral difficulties, just like I mentioned, adjusting to change. Some have the inability to develop supportive relationships, okay, like a coach that you believe in or a teammate who believes in you. If you don't have those foundations, that's fine. A lot of times in the inner city of Minneapolis, we have a lot of young people who are from broken homes and they don't have a father figure that helps support their pursuits or even have a parent that supports their pursuits. Oftentimes that's difficult for them to get through a transition such as this. Lack materials or resources that can help, for example. So resources such as an academic counselor that can help guide you to value academics as well. Okay. So what helps? Mental preparation and planning. I did some research. A lot of my Ph.D. research was on NFL players. I was able to, at 3 times, one for my dissertation and then twice after my studies, to interview NFL players on what they were going to do, what they thought they were going to do when they retired. So they're active, okay? I'm engaging them to have an opinion on what do they think it's going to be like when they retire. Okay? So, one of the most important things that helps in that transition is to prepare before they retire. Okay? Maybe some of them went back to finish their college degree. Maybe some of them did internships and alternative careers in their off season. Okay, to prepare for that time when football will always end. Okay, and when it ends, you can't go back. So you have to have a bridge there. And some of them develop relationships with people who weren't in sport at all. And that helps also. Identity and self-worth is not only source of self-worth. So, if you're good in something besides football, that helps. If you go to work part-time for a business in real estate, which is a far cry from playing football, for example, if you have some talent in that area, that helps the transition a lot more. And, of course, having the focus, a newfound focus in life. Being able to focus on something else. What I did oftentimes in my off season, I certainly went back to school, which was good. I developed a rapport with other professionals in institutions like University of Minnesota, professors, classmates who had vested interest in what I was doing, as well as they had their own focus on research and sport. That really helped because I had a newfound area of study that I was passionate about. So one of the things that I think helps is to be able to understand that you can have multiple identities. And we're not trying to say that you're psychologically deterred, but you can have multiple identities. You can be a football player, for example, and be a scholar. Okay? You can be a football player and learn how to lay tile in your home. okay, or fix your plumbing. You can't be a football player and also own your own business, for example. Okay? One of the things I want to end here with is that as we talk about the socialization of our youth, how young men and women be able to be socialized by our culture, to participate in sport and be identified as an athlete, we always want to talk about what are some of those social forces that are important in that transition. Whether it's a transition to become a better athlete at a different level, or whether there's a transition to be a non-athlete. But the push is sometimes because of economic dislocation, where you can't find jobs in your city, or there's nothing really that motivates you to do anything else like get a job. So in some respects, we have student athletes, try out for their sports team because they're not interested in anything else. Okay, social isolation. Sometimes it's because you don't have any friends, and we said being on a sport team helps in that respect. Drug entering the inner cities, particularly when we talk about some of these marginalized groups. In this case, in the kids who are from the inner city, there's not many resources there for them to hang on to. Not many resources such as young aspiring adults that they can emulate. And the fact that jobs are left to the suburbs and overseas, this is an economic issue when it comes to socializing our youth to be adults. Some of the pull that gets kids excited about maybe being involved in sport. Colleges offering scholarships. Okay? Some of the blacks become the preferred workers. Did you know that there's a notion that African American athletes are dominating sports in our culture? That can't be, because there's only 4 or 5 sports in which they are overrepresented. Okay, football, basketball, track and field possibly, maybe boxing. A lot of ethnic minorities are boxing. But you don't see them on the ski slopes. You don't see them in the swimming pool. Okay? They're not necessarily playing lacrosse, which is one of the newfound games in this culture. Okay? Even basketball at the level of the NAIA level, Division II and III level, there's very few African American athletes. Okay? So oftentimes in our culture from the 1950s on, they've become the preferred worker in some sports. Okay, you have the draw of professional leagues, widening access, okay, to all of the aspiring leagues that are out there, and the financial opportunity, which we know is a motivator, and then a positive racial niche where equality comes into play, where oftentimes we want to marginalize people for their racial identity, but in fact, there are a lot of opportunities for any kid to be able to participate in any sport. Certainly there's some economic barriers. Okay. One of the things I listed at the last line is, which is so indicative of sport nowadays, is the notion or the ideology of masculinity and how it is manifested in sports so much. Okay? For example, in basketball, well, let's just take women's sports in general. We've heard of the educational legislation that adopted Title IX. Okay? By the way, Title IX is 43 years old, and we still have institutions who have not complied with Title IX because it's because we have this notion that the male model is the best model to a certain extent, and if the male model is the best model, the male model needs to be headed by males. Okay? Now we have this notion with our culture also. Okay, equal opportunity, equal access, equal pay for equal work. It also is in sport. But more than likely, sport is a site where masculinity abounds. There's a lot of resistance, but it abounds. So one of the things that I do with my class is, let's forget about the numbers, how many dunks this person had, how many points this person had, how many tackles this person had, how many layups, let's forget about the numbers, the scores. What's underneath all of this cultural makeup of sport in our society? What is it about a kid who identifies himself as an athlete and can't think of anything else to get motivated about? Okay? I mean, the chances of him being a scientist, a physician, a math professor, licensed carpenter are much greater than it is to become a professional athlete. So what is it about our culture that endorses this much more than it does academic progress? I'm going to leave that to you. I understand that we're getting close. I like to talk, but I want to leave you with that. So if I were to tell you about how I was socialized as a student athlete, I would say yes. I had a lot of agents. Incidentally, my father didn't really push me into sport. I just followed him around and got self-interest. But I did have friends who were very interested in sport and physical activity. I had a mother who was a physical education teacher. So to have a professional athlete as a dad and a physical education teacher as a mom really helped that interest. But the whole notion of what it means to be a male in this culture over the years, particularly in the 50s and 60s and 70s, what it means to be a male sometimes equals participating in sports. Okay, not so much now, but certainly I'm of the belief that that had a lot to do with my makeup and my interest in sports. That's what males are supposed to do. They were supposed to be physically active. And not so much for females, obviously. What were females culturally expected to do? Well, you know. It wasn't to participate in sports, even after Title IX. So, one of the things that we have to be concerned with when we look at sport from a theoretical perspective or a scientific perspective is that sport affirms masculinity. Okay? So what is masculinity? Well, it's a gender ideology that tells us what it means to be a male and what it means to be a female. Simply put. And that's changed over the years, obviously. Okay, so what does it mean to be a male in a sport dominated by males, like football? Okay, what does it mean to be a female who is participating in a sport like ice dancing or skating? For that matter, what does it mean to be a male who's participating in ice dancing and skating? You may come up with different ideas about what that means, for example. Okay, I'm done. I am done. Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions. Is that correct? Okay. Yes.
So it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's much more difficult for athletes coming out of college today to transition if they go into professional sports.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't, not we, but society or whoever, professional sports is not putting enough pressure on them to get a college degree. So if I'm coming out with 1 year or 2 years, and my longevity in MBA is going to be, that's a half dozen years, and maybe half dozen years in professional football or whatever. I'm not even 30 years old, and I may have some money in the bank, I may not.
Yeah.
But I don't have a career because I didn't get a degree. So What's the answer?
Well, I tell you what, I always believe the cultural expectation of a student athlete in college is that you better play well on Saturday. It's not, play well on Saturday and stay eligible. The cultural expectation is not for a student athlete to graduate with honors. So the cultural expectation is that you satisfy the masses who are coming to see you play, and you better be ready to play well. Okay? Because if you don't, then we're going to fire your coach and get someone in there who can get a person who can play better.
Do you think we're ever going to get to a point where we put that onus on students and say, hey, you got to finish the degree before we bring you in? Or is it money so important and all that so important that that's never going to happen?
Well, I think you touch on some things that are improving. The graduation rates are going to reflect the entry requirements primarily and the eligibility requirements. So if a person stays eligible throughout his or her career, more than likely they're going to be close to graduating. Now, the thing is, institutions sometimes are penalized for not graduating their students. So that's one thing that the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA, has placed in their task bar, is just because the person is exhausted his eligibility isn't all that we need from you. That person needs to graduate as well. So I think those systematic structures are in place. However, I mentioned to you that when a student athlete gets to campus, not only does he have the pressures and the concerns of other students, he has other concerns as well as a student athlete. Okay? So he's devoted 20 hours a week for football, for example, or to his or her sport. That takes a lot of time, not only time, but energy away from student athletes. And it's difficult to compete that way. Now, I'm not saying that non-student athletes don't have pressures either. A lot of non-student athletes have jobs. They even work on campus. They do work study. I mean, there are other issues with students that are not athletes that come into play too. But what comes with the student athlete is that there's injuries, which they are beset by, which take time to heal and become an emotional consequence for them as well. So that's the underlying message, I think, from this whole transitional piece and the socialization piece is that, you know, if you're identified as an athlete, what comes with that is more than just being a performer on the field or on the court. It's all that underlying socialization process that occurs that we need to understand, that makes it difficult for student athletes to graduate or to become citizens. Now, with all this time expended on what it is to be a student athlete, do you think they have time to develop a craft or an alternative profession? And more than likely nowadays, in this postmodern era, student athletes are actually graduating from college without any practical experience. No job history whatsoever. We have a student athlete who is going to graduate from Minneapolis North High School this summer. And in 2 weeks after that, he's going to enroll at the University of Minnesota and take classes. Okay? So he only gets a 2-week break. But what comes with that, with the 6 hours that he has to take during the summer, he's training for 6 hours too. Okay? When we talk about social isolation, it's not going to be like he's the regular college and high school student in the summer. Whether you get a job, you have fun, you go travel. I mean, no. This scholarship student athlete is really involved in helping the institutional makeup of that athletic department. Now, you guys got to come back next week when the athletic director from the University of Minnesota talks. Now, her framework is going to be a little different than mine. Okay? She's gonna give you some of what I've talked about. But hers is going to come from more of an institutionalized nature of what sport is all about. Okay? So it'd be a good way to kind of reflect on what I say and compare it to what she says. Okay. By the way, Beth Guest is a person that I worked with. I did work at the University of Minnesota for 10 years in athletics and 2 years with Beth, so it's a treat. I wish I can come down and see her talk, but she will be enjoyable, and certainly we may be looking at the next athletic director at the University of Minnesota too, so look forward to that. Did you have a question?
Yeah,
Sure.
just a comment.
Okay.
Going back before your time, but the society's perception of sports has changed tremendously.
Of course.
I'm thinking of the 40s and 50s,
Mm-hmm.
when the world came to a stop completely
Yeah.
during World Series time.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody had it on the radio.
Of course.
All work stopped.
Yeah.
All that was over, and that was during the daytime.
Mhm.
A lot of the games were not played at night.
Yeah, yeah,
But now you have the equivalent probably of Super Bowl. It's glitzy, it's got a,
Mhm.
a halftime show, and, you know, to draw people in, not
Yep.
necessarily the athletics
Yep.
as much as the glitz. But there's one thing that still draws people, and that's the World Cup.
the World Cup?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's an international game.
It's an international,
Yep.
even the people in the U.S. watch it.
That's, of course, of course. And you make an interesting notion about why sports is so important in this respect. I think when I told you about the fact that there's more people who are spectators than there are people who are actually participating and are physically active, okay? So it does lend itself to the entertainment value of sports, obviously. But some sports are just just spectacles. They're not have any more value beyond entertainment. One of the things that we talk about is professional wrestling. Is that a sport? Well, it is because of all the notions of what defines sports. Okay, it's governed. It's it's institutional. It has rules, albeit we might not believe that these rules are standardized. But again, why is it so popular? Okay, so it lends to the entertainment value that we all expect in this culture. You have back here.
First of all, thanks for playing for the Vikings. It was a good time.
All right, thank you so much.
The second thing is, are we doing anything in colleges to help the athletes transition,
Mm-hmm.
or are they a commodity? If a student doesn't make it in the second year,
Of course.
kind of thrown out, like they're no good anymore.
Well, it certainly could be. Legally, it could be because these student athletes. Let's just talk about the Division I level where you have more financial aid for student athletes, but they're only one-year contracts. Okay, so in some respects, in some sports where scholarships are limited, it is about who performs the best. Okay. A third of student athletes, even at the University of Minnesota, are competing without being on scholarship also. So let's not forget that. There are definitely student athletes at the Division I level who are competing and are not getting financial aid. All right? But there is life development processes that go on in a lot of these institutions. Of course, there are a lot there for student athletes to grab onto, but there's only so much time in the day. And I think that's what is the detriment to their development.
Well, the follow-up is, why are so many people that are turned pro, they get to the pro level, what is it, 75 or 80 or 90% are bankrupt within 3 years after?
Well, that has something to do with the career development issues that are lacking. Remember I told you about the planning ahead of time before the event occurs? Most often they don't they don't take finance class, but part of it is just the role of a professional athlete, what's expected. Okay, but I think it would happen in any endeavor where you make a lot of money. I know we would. We would do it differently, wouldn't we? Certainly would. Yes.
You talk about sports developing moral values.
Mm-hmm. It's a site where moral values is endorsed.
Why do so many athletes miss that? Because every time you turn around, somebody's getting dismissed from
Mhm.
the team or suspended.
Yeah. Well, it's going to always be the case when you have such a high-profile industry. people value it so much. So they're so, like when I talked about the postmodern look where people are so critical, they have their own truths and beliefs, okay? And it's not just one thought about that. But, and I want to bridge it to your thought about the fallacy that there's a lot of people playing professional sports. There's only 5,000 professional athletes in the United States. Okay? So the whole notion of then, again, understanding that we always hear about these athletes and their violent and deviant behavior, well, there's just a few of them. I didn't. Okay, there's just a few of them. But because they're so high profile and well valued, you know, they're going to be in the news. We talked about when we talk about violence and abuse, whether it's drugs or whether it's domestic abuse, you know, these athletes who are high profile and valued so much in our culture are certainly going to be in the news. Of course. But it's not to really have a blanket over all of them to say that they're all doing this or they're all doing that. I would say having a lot of money in your pocket makes you a little bit more friskier. There's no doubt about that. You think you can do everything. And that's for anyone. Yes.
Yeah, I have a nephew that's always good at hockey.
Okay.
And his father had to drive him all over Duluth, and even if
Yeah.
up there, you know, the towns are far out, and many guys, he's got a lot of, my brother-in-law spent a lot of hours on his own, and my nephew, he had strong will, you know, and he studied everything all the time, but he made it through high school, and now he's in the financial business.
All right.
I think that drive probably in college, I mean, playing hockey, I think helped them.
Well, good. That's a good example of how these skills that you learn in sport can transfer into making you someone else. Can help you in your academics, can help you in your chosen pursuit, professional pursuit, and you adopt these behaviors, which in this case are profitable behaviors that can help him in the field of finance. That's a good example. Yes.
You said you started working on your Ph.D. in like 1986?
Yes.
Okay, so that's 5 years before your NFL career ended. How unusual in that Vikings locker room was it? I mean, how many other guys out there were already thinking about their future? Obviously, you were thinking about life after football
Yes.
at that point. That 5 years before the season.
Why do you think I was?
Oh, because you said you were worried you were going to get cut.
That's right. So that's right. I had to figure something. Man, if
other
I
guys were taking steps to be
Yeah.
ready for the day when their name shows up on the cut list.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what. Back in the day, we're talking about the 80s, 1980s. It seems so far away. But I think relatively so. We weren't making as much money. And the notion of working in the off season was a standard. So many of us, you know, did employ social practices of trying other endeavors. You know, very few of us were in the off season not doing anything, for example. So there were a number of us that graduated from college and started working before our career ended. And we have a number of people who are still doing that today and are very successful.
Can you name any of them? I'm just curious.
Well, Steve Jordan, for example, was a all-pro tight end. You know, he's been a civil engineer ever since, you know, he got out of Brown University. You know, we've got Tim Irwin, who was a tackle for us and has been a judge in Tennessee for a long time. And, you know, I think even some of the people around town, you know, you have Greg Coleman, who was a studio analyst as well as an on-field analyst for the Vikings. He's sold in the corporate community for a long time, sold parts in communication parts in the corporate community for a while. But on the side, he works for the Vikings too. You know, I think, excuse me. I would say this though. A number of athletes, not so much today because the professional athletes make so much money nowadays comparatively. Their careers are shorter, but they're making a whole bunch of money relative to what we made back in the 80s. I would say that there are other issues that have really cropped up. I mean, the whole issue of entitlement, for example, and the whole issue of the physical consequences of playing. Concussions are part of the issues right now with them. I think those are becoming more prominent narratives in the transition of athletes that in some respects it's been detrimental to the whole notion of being a professional athlete and what the cost might be in terms of the psychological, physical, and emotional makeup of a lot of individuals. So even though a lot of these professional athletes, for example, and student athletes are heralded for what they do, I think there is more of a rational look at post-career life, more so now than it ever has been. Yes?
One last question. Physically, how are you? Any new hip?
Hey, I'm standing. I can dance. I've been very, very fortunate. I haven't had, I broke my leg in college, but I've had 2 knee surgeries, both orthoscopic surgeries, so I'm not a candidate for a replacement yet, but knee replacement. But I do have arthritis. I do have, things that prohibit me from walking straight sometimes, and I think one of the fortunate things that I don't have is that I don't have any pain that prohibits me from getting a good night's sleep. But I'm not as bad as some of my teammates, though, because I think Fred McNeil, who just passed recently, was a linebacker for the Vikings. Recently died of complications from memory loss and other aspects of that. And, certainly some of my teammates have prominently admitted to concussion-related symptoms. And it's certainly one of the things that I have to be cautious about. And I've been tested, so I'm okay so far. But being a wide receiver, you don't get hit as much as you would if you were a defensive player, which on every play almost you're in a concussion-type situation. So most defensive players are getting these symptoms much more frequently than offensive players are. But I think, as long as I'm standing and able to talk to you, I'm okay, I guess. But it's tough getting old, isn't it?
I'm going to ask the last question real quick. I haven't met a lot of former NFLers who have a Ph.D.
Mm-hmm.
John, ask me a question. How many NFLers have got a Ph.D.?
I don't know of too many. I don't keep the stat. But I tell you what, one of the things that really drove me was first interest. I was telling you, I was kind of living my career in transition, while I was playing, because every year I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to make the team, So I had to find something else to do, and it was an emotional thing. It was a practical thing as well, because I had to make a living. At the same time, one of the things that I do like is kind of the history of sport, particularly in the United States. I'm really fond on the history of black athletes and how it mirrors our culture with ethnic minorities in our history as a country. That's really fascinating. But I run a foundation. I have a sports foundation that mentors youth, and I've had that for about 15 years. So I'm getting ready to talk on in the Twin Cities about volunteerism, and I've been doing that ever since my playing days. Really devoting time to the community and using my name to a certain extent, but also my experience to engage youth in the same things as understanding identity development in sports. So I think all of this kind of circles around the whole notion of being scholarly in the area, which I think is something that you don't find too many athletes doing. They're more a part of the spectacle of sport. Let's put it that way. So,
Well, thank you very much.
all right, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Okay, so then we'll do the door prize drawing. Do we want to
Uh-oh.
draw a name?
It's emotional time.